We are in Hebrews chapter 7, sorry, chapter 11, but we're starting in verse 7. We've finished the first six verses. So, starting in verse 7, if you remember last week, we ended off with that very familiar verse that says, without faith, it is impossible to please God. So, if we want to please God, we want God smiling in our direction, then the only way, the only means to please Him is by faith. And now the author goes on that long list, what is often referred to as the Hall of Faith. Imagine yourself walking down this aisle and you have different pictures of all the stalwarts of faith on either side, and he's taking you down for a guided tour. And the next character on the list is none other than Noah. And verse 7 of Hebrews 11 says, by faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness that comes by faith. The book of Genesis uses about six chapters to tell us in detail, in some amount of detail, regarding the life of Noah and all the events surrounding his life. Six chapters. But the author of Hebrews distills that, summarizes all those six chapters into just one verse, verse 7. That's all we have about Noah. But it's a wonderful summary. Noah's faith is exemplary. He's a great role model because he stood against a hostile world. Just maybe you can say, just maybe his family members stood by him. Only they supported him. Everybody else probably thought that he had gone crazy or that he had lost his mind. And Noah's faith is a good example of the Hebrews 11:1 definition. It is the hope of things unseen. So just imagine for a second Noah building this massive ark because God has given him these instructions, he's given him the specifications, and he's given him the warning of the flood to come. And so imagine him building this massive ark, and all the people, all the worldly people around him, ridiculing him, making fun of him, saying, "What are you building this massive ark?" Some scholars, some theologians even speculate that up until the point of Noah, because there was a blanket that was covering the earth, then it may have never rained. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but it is possible that it had never rained on the earth thus far until the time of Noah. And some people believe that for many reasons. So you can imagine Noah explaining to the people a big flood is coming. Even if it had rained before, they would have never expected it to rain to such an extent that the whole earth was flooded, and the only means of escape was the ark that Noah was building. So everybody probably thought that he had lost it, but he had a reverent fear. Some, some time ago, someone told my wife that all of you Christians are brainwashed. And there used to be a man, I read a story about a man who used to walk down the sidewalks wearing a sandwich board with the words, "I am a fool for Christ," painted on the front. And on the back, when he passed a certain person, when he passed you, on the back of the sandwich board were the words, "Whose fool are you?" Many political activists, many cultists, many lobbyists, they're willing to be a fool for whatever cause they are promoting, whatever cause they're fighting for, standing for. But the question is, how much more as Christians are we willing to look like fools for Christ's cause? I mean, to the outside world, we will look like fools, but we have every reason to become, for them to consider us foolish because we know ultimately it is us who are being wise. So Noah looked like a fool to the watching world, to the observing world, but in the end, his faith was vindicated when that big storm broke out and the whole earth was flooded. And it was by his faith and reverent fear he condemned the world. Every act of faith condemns the world. Someone said, live a holy life, and if there is a crooked stick and you want to show how crooked the stick is, you need not waste words in description. just place a straight one by the side of it, and the thing is explained very directly. You don't have to keep explaining, oh, this is how crooked this is. Just place a straight stick next to this crooked stick, and you'll see the difference, and the point will be made loud and clear. So Noah condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness, which is by faith. There was this man called Harry R. Truman, and he was not the 33rd president of the United States, another guy. And he lived in this beautiful rustic log cabin by the pristine waters of Lake Spirit, and this was in the woods of Washington. And in 1980, the year was 1980, when geologists and weather experts came and government officials came to his house and they warned him that there is an active volcano very close by Mount St. Helens. They said there's an active volcano, you better evacuate, you better run away to safety. But he did not heed any of their warnings. He was extremely stubborn about it. And when the volcano did finally come, it was too late for him, and he was buried somewhere beneath the molten and the ash. And so God has given us warnings. Even as we went through the book of Revelation, you probably recollect all those warnings about the last days. Question is, will we be found faithful to heed all those warnings? Noah was a man who preached through his lifestyle. I mean, he may have said a couple of things to different people. He may have explained what God told him, but he mainly preached through his lifestyle, through the choices that he made, through the building of the ark. I heard a story about Billy Graham, who once was playing golf, and he was playing the all the 18 holes, and he was playing with a guy who wasn't a believer. And after the 18th hole, after they completed that session, the man who was not a believer was seen by another believer, not Billy Graham, by another believer getting into his car very angrily. He opened the boot, he opened the trunk, and he threw in all the clubs, and he was very, very irate, very angry. So the other believer noticed him, a little bit concerned, and he came up to him and he said, "What happened? Why are you so angry?" He said, I played with Billy. I played 18 holes with him, and he keeps shoving religion down your throat, keeps thumping me with the Bible, and he kept on telling me about Christianity, and then this other friend who knew Billy knew that Billy wasn't this type of a person to shove religion down somebody's throat. So, anyways, out of curiosity, he asked him, "So tell me, and I'm really curious to know, what did Billy say to you?" And this man started looking a little bit sheepish. He started looking down and he said, "Well, actually, to tell you the truth, he didn't say anything." In other words, it was just the way that Billy carried himself. It's just the fact from hole after hole that he moved through that golf course. It's just the way he carried himself that spoke volumes. And it's the same thing for us as well. Our lives should speak volumes. Noah's life spoke volumes to the people. It was through his acts of faith that he condemned the world. I mean, he was facing a hostile world, chose to follow God's, for others, it would have been ridiculous directions to build an ark on dry land. But when God promised, that flood came at the exact moment that He promised, and His faith was vindicated. And so, the question is, are we willing to preach through our lifestyle, through our choices? Moving on in verse 8, it says, Hebrews 11:8. It says, by faith, new character, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in a land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. Abraham went out not knowing. That phrase caught my attention. He went out not knowing where he was going. And that's a great example of faith. Some of us find it really hard to carry on or to take baby steps of faith because we want the whole blueprint. We want to know everything that's going to happen. We want all detailed instructions. And it's really difficult at times to take steps when you can't see where you're going. But according to the Bible and according to what the author of Hebrews says, those steps, those baby steps, really please the Lord. And when we step out in faith, He comes and He guides us. He holds our hands and He guides us step after step. And in the case of Abraham, faith did not know where. Faith also sometimes does not know why. If you look at the book of Habakkuk, it says, in verses 2 or 3, he keeps asking God, why? Why are you allowing all this evil to exist around us? So in his case, it was a question of why. So faith doesn't know why. In Abraham's case, faith doesn't know where. Habakkuk's case, faith doesn't know why. And then also, faith does not know what. When Peter asked regarding John, what will this man do? He asked Jesus, he said, what is it to you? So many times faith doesn't have all the answers. Sometimes you don't know sometimes you don't know why, sometimes you don't know what. God doesn't give us all the explanations. But one thing we do know faith is, and that is, I know whom I have believed. And that's what faith is. I know who I am. I have believed. We may not know the what, the why, the where. We know whom we have believed. Reading on verses 9 and 10. Yeah, by faith he went on to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. He left his comfort zone. He was living in tents. I mean, he left everything that was familiar. He left his family behind, and we later learned that they were all idol worshippers. He left his family behind. He went to a foreign land. He lived with Isaac, with Jacob in tents. He left his comfort zone. May not have been very comfortable for Abraham. And faith looks for, reading these verses, you see, faith looks for a prepared home. It says its builder and maker is God. John chapter 14, all of us know that promise. It's there up on the wall in Revival Church, and it talks about Jesus saying, I go to prepare a place for you. And over the last 2,000 years, he's been preparing a place. So you can imagine that that place will be pretty magnificent, pretty impressive. Faith also looks for a perfect home. God is perfection. He's perfect in all his ways. So there isn't going to be any flaws in this new home. There's not going to be leaks, and it's not going to have a weak foundation. It's going to be absolutely perfect. Faith also looks for a permanent home, not like the tents that Abraham dwelt in, but the foundations will be permanent. And so Abraham saw by faith what John saw in detail in Revelation. Again, we've been through it, that city coming down, the New Jerusalem. Abraham saw that through the eyes of faith. And one of the worst feelings, I don't know if you've experienced it, but if you were ever into a TV show, especially back in the day, now everything is available. It's all available at the click of a button. But those days, if you were following a serial or you watched some documentaries, when I remember when I was small, when I used to watch Cartoon Network, that's where all the cartoons were shown. And this was after school. I would come home at about 4:30. I remember all the cartoons. But those days when I was young, growing up, Cartoon Network closed or stopped at 5:30 p.m. every day. So that's all you got to watch. 5:30 p.m. there'll be like this curtains closing, and it all disappears, and another channel, a movie channel, would start. So I knew that every day only till 5:30. So at the end of at 5:30 p.m., those words, to be continued. Have you ever seen those words in a serial? You watch it, it's really, really interesting. It leave you with a cliffhanger, and then those words appear on the screen, to be continued. For the Christian, sometimes you're so fixated on this life, but the truth is, on our tombstones, it should be inscribed, to be continued above, because this life is not all there is. We have an eternity that awaits us. And so it should be written on our tombstones. It would be an apt description if it says, to be continued above. This life is short, 70, 80 years, as the psalmist says, but then we have an eternity with God, a beautiful life with God, where we can look forward to a prepared home, a perfect home, and a permanent home with Him. And so, as Abraham, while Abraham's feet were in Canaan, his heart was in heaven. He always looked forward. He knew that he was a foreigner. He knew that he was just a sojourner passing through this life. I don't know if you've had the experience of being a foreigner. I'm sure some of you have. You maybe went to a different country. I remember I had that experience when I went to England. And when I went to England, to this place where we were volunteering, and I've mentioned this place several times, I remember particularly one or two people over there who were there in that center for many years, saying, them telling me that I'm special because because they've never had an Indian there for many years. And that fact really shocked me, because think about it, Indians are everywhere. Every nook and corner of the earth, you have Indians. They're spread all over. But in that place, they said we have not had an Indian here for many years. And so it's very nice. It's very special to have, right after that, another guy came from India, but I was the first guy in a long time. And so it made me feel, if truth be told, made me feel a little bit special being the only Indian, that too being an Indian, Indians who are everywhere. In that place, I was the only Indian in a long time. And so, just being treated like a foreigner. So in the same way, when people look at us, there should be certain characteristics because that define us, that describe us, and also because of the lifestyle choices that cause others to regard us as foreigners, as aliens, because we're set apart. We're to be holy. We're to make certain choices, our lifestyle, our conduct, our words, everything that we say, the way that we carry ourselves, the decisions that we make. So our feet are planted in Bangalore, but our heart is in heaven, our mind is in heaven. We need to set our mind on things above, as Colossians 3:2 says. So the next character that he describes and mentions is Sarah, and that is verses 11 and 12. Verses 11 and 12 says, by faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. So Sarah in her 90s, with Abraham probably just almost 100 years old. I mean, if you thought of her and her mind, and in her mind a weighing scale, do I trust the promises of God that He will give me a child? Or should I rely on the fact that, biology, my body, the condition of my body is way beyond that childbearing age? And she chose to rely. She chose to rely on the promises of God. And the story is told, common one, of two frogs that fell into a tub of cream. And one frog looked at the side of the tub and the high walls, and immediately became despondent, became depressed, and said, I'll never make it out of here. Gave up, resigned to death, sank to the bottom, died there. But the other frog was determined, resilient, and said, I'm going to do something, something will happen, and started kicking and swimming and churning. And slowly but surely, that tub of cream turned into butter, and it created a solid platform from which that frog could launch out of the tub, jumped out of the tub. And so faith is believing that something will happen. Faith is the confident, we remember Hebrews 11, faith is the confident expectation of things unseen. It's a confident hope that God is going to do something. And so verses 13 to 16, let me just read it to you. It says, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared for them. So the patriarchs all died in faith. It was the Methodist founder, John Wesley, who said, our people die well, that is, Christians die well. Somebody also said, a living faith will lead to a dying faith. If you endure in faith while you're alive, and it constantly grows and progresses, and you grow in your sanctification, you will also die in a very beautiful way. That is, you will die full of faith until your last breath. So they didn't see the divine promises. I mean, Abraham never saw his numerous progeny. The Hebrew nation never ever possessed all the land. Maybe it extended a lot to the proportions that God had promised under David's and Solomon's rule, but never to the extent that God had outlined in the book of Deuteronomy. The Old Testament saints never saw the promised Messiah. Think about it. They got clues, they had vague ideas and pictures, but they never saw Jesus, the Old Testament saints. But they have this telescopic vision, and it's almost like as if they saw those promises and waved at those promises from a distance with their telescope of faith, looking at it with the eyes of faith. And so they realized, the patriarchs did, that this world is not their home. And this was in spite of the fact that many of the promises to Israel were material, because back then blessing was not so much spiritual as it was material. I mean, of course, the blessings were spiritual, but many of when a person was blessed, they were like, you take the example of Abraham or Job. They were materially, they were very rich. That's how the Old Testament was. In the New Testament, it takes on a more spiritual angle. All the blessings were blessed. We're seated with Him in the heavenlies, according to Ephesians 2. So, in saying that they were seeking a homeland, the author is not saying that they wanted to return to their place of birth, because if Abraham wanted to, he could have returned to Mesopotamia, which is where he came from. But what he's referring to is that heavenly homeland, which is very remarkable. As I said, many of their blessings were material, and yet they had those glimpses of the future where they will be with God in heaven forever. And that's what they looked forward to. There was this ship that was called the Empress of Ireland, and at some point it went down. And when it went down, there were on board 130 Salvation Army officers, amongst many others unbelievers, but 130 Salvation Army officers, out of which only 21 of those Salvation Army officers survived. And of the 109 that drowned, not one of them went down with a life jacket. Many of the survivors later explained how these brave people from the Salvation Army, seeing that the other person, whoever it was, did not have a life jacket, life preserver, took their own life jacket off and gave it to them as saying, I know Jesus, so I can die better than you can. I know Jesus, so I can die better than you can. And they gave them their jackets. And again, an article in the San Francisco newspaper talks about this man once was looking down and he spotted a $5 bill. And from that time of spotting that $5 bill, he resolved never to look up again. He said, I'm going to spend my life looking down always. And so over the years, he accumulated 29,516 buttons, 54,172 pins, and 12 cents, and a bent back and a miserly disposition. But he also lost, if you think about it, but he also lost the glory of the sunlight, the radiance of the stars, the smiles of friends, and the freshness of the blue skies. Some Christians are like this man. They're so focused on things of the earth. They're always looking down. But we need to look up. We need to look at eternal things. We need to look through the eyes, through the telescope of faith, to things that are promised in the future. Now, the last the last three verses, 17 to 19, Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it is said, though through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. This was probably, no doubt, the greatest test of Abraham's faith, if you think about it. He's come to the ultimate test, and he passed with flying colors. So you can imagine Isaac probably in his late teens, early 20s. Some people say even he was in his 30s. And so Abraham even believed. I mean, you can imagine that promise. God promises that he'll have numerous children, and the promise will be fulfilled through Isaac and not Ishmael. It's through Isaac. But now God is saying you offer Isaac as a sacrifice. You can imagine the dilemma, the confusion in his mind, and yet he chose to trust God to the point that even after Isaac was slain and sacrificed, God has the power to resurrect him. In a very real sense, it was him, Abraham, who first mentions that idea of the resurrection. Of course, it's going to happen many years later. Abraham's son was spared, but God would not spare his own son on that same Mount Moriah, where he would be sacrificed many thousands of years later. And so he really passed that test with flying colors. And I hope those stories like that will remind us, will inspire us to have a remarkable faith. I want to end with this story of a familiar person that most of you know, George Mueller. It's said that he was very wild in his young days, but then he was finally saved in his 20s. And he began this orphanage in Bristol. In 1877, he was on a ship that was stalled just off the coast of Newfoundland. And the captain was on the bridge for about 24 hours when Mueller approached him, and he said, I need to be in Quebec by Saturday afternoon. The captain said, that's absolutely impossible. Did you see the fog out there? And Mueller responded by saying, "Okay, if your ship can't take me, God will find a different way for me to go." And he explained that he had never missed an engagement for 52 years. And the captain said, "Just look how dense this fog is. And how do you expect me to move?" Mueller said, "My eye is not on the density of the fog, but on the living God who controls every circumstance of my life." So Mueller said, "Come and join me for prayer." He took the captain down. They went down into the deck, and both of them, Mueller started praying. And when Mueller said, "Amen," captain was about to pray for the fog to be lifted. But Mueller said, "It's okay. You don't have to pray because I believe and you are having doubts." And so, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, "You don't have to pray." He said, "I know that God is going to do it." And he said, "Captain, why don't you go and open the door to see if the fog is lifted?" That's how much faith Mueller had. And the captain went and opened the door, and the fog had lifted, and they were able to leave, and he was able to make his engagement. And so, may each one of us also live life through the lens, through the eyes of faith, because without faith, it is impossible to please God.